Hello. A very big thank you to those of you who are making it a consistent appointment to join me on a regular basis. I thank you for those of you who are helping us to proclaim this message on social media by sharing, by retweeting, by liking our posts. Today, I start a brand new series of teachings on a topic that I consider very, very unique and important, and that is the topic of fasting and prayer. I have called this fasting and prayer demystified. And the reason why we use the word demystified is because the topic of fasting and prayer seem to be an enigmatic one. Those who love it. Those who hate it. And in the middle are people who are possibly confused. A lot of people are doing it, but very few are doing it the right way. So I have taken the challenge to do a series of teachings on it. Hopefully, we can meet a need by bridging the gap of knowledge. So this is the first in the series. I'm going to take as much time as is possible and necessary to do justice to this topic. And today we are talking on the topic to fast or not to fast. Let's go right in. You see, the topic of fasting is as old as humanity itself. It's very, very old. It dates back to thousands and thousands of years before any one of us came around here. There is record of natural philosophers like a gentleman called Asclepius who used fasting for curative purposes, health purposes. In fact, a Roman historian called Plutarch said, instead of using medicine, fast a day. Okay, and if you read history of the Chinese or even Hindu writings, you will find out that there are proofs that they also used fasting. Native American Indians also used or practiced the art of fasting. Virtually all the major religions in the world, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, practice one form of fasting or the other. So this makes it to be pervasive, especially amongst those who are religious. But the truth is that many people are doing it, but very little. In fact, if you are a Christian, I challenge you to think about the last time you heard a full 30 minutes message on fasting. In my country, uh, it's natural that in the beginning of the year, January in particular, virtually all religious organizations, denominations, set up some time to fast, ranging from 2, 3 days to 2100 days. But hardly would you have a 30 minutes time set aside to say what exactly is fasting, how do we do it. So in spite of the fact that it is a cornerstone of the Christian faith, very few teaching is being done about it. It most like, reminds me. So we just need to be careful, and I really want to bridge that gap. Okay, the truth is, fasting has many benefits, and whether you look at it from a health perspective or a spiritual perspective, there is a lot of advantages to it. And I will take a little bit of time to talk about that today. And in the future, I will take a specific dedicated edition of this program to talk about the benefit of it. The truth is that we need to go back to this age-old practice. But today I want to go into the Bible to see how we should do it, because there is so much of mistake. Like I said, there are people who love fasting and who do it. There are people who don't even do it at all, in spite of the fact that it's an age-old tradition and practice. Today it looks like we are gradually moving away from it, especially the modern and younger people are like, oh, fasting, you want to sentence me to death, I don't want to have anything to do with it. So it must be that there is a knowledge gap, or we don't just know what are the benefits. The Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. I remember a story that one brother told me, and I've had many, many versions of such. I call them fasting horror stories. In a particular story, a particular denomination, one of the largest in the country, had declared an extended fasting, and on the last day of that fast, according to this brother, I said the brother who was leading the prayer meeting had to be carried onto the platform so that he could lead the prayer. Now, that is a horror story. Something must be wrong if somebody who is leading a prayer meeting had to be carried. He could not walk. He didn't have strength. He was emaciated. That something is wrong because of passion and lack of knowledge, we do many of these things wrong. And if we do it wrong, it means we will chase people away from it. So today I want to be able to say, are you supposed to fast? For those who do not know, and for those who know, we want to have a solid foundation. I don't want to assume that you do know it. Let's read Matthew chapter 6 from verse 17 and 18. Jesus, teaching his disciples, said, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. I dare say openly, because elsewhere Jesus talked about, God rewarding you openly. The truth is that he said, when you fast. He didn't say if you fast. He said, when you fast. When speaks of the necessity. In fact, he took it for granted that they were going to fast. And the reason is they should fast. Okay? The other part I want to emphasize is the reward part. He says, your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. Again, emphasis on assurances, God will reward you. So there are benefits to fasting. When you do it right, you get a lot of benefit. Unfortunately, when you do it wrong, you do not get the right rewards. And I hope to be able to help you by showing you how to do it right. That's what I want to do in this series of teachings. If you study the history of mankind, like I've said, you see old people, ancient cultures who practiced it, whether for spiritual purposes or for health purposes. But in terms of Bible history, all through Bible, we saw people fasting. Moses fasted, okay, David fasted, the other prophets fasted, and in the period that Jesus lived, the Pharisees fasted. As a matter of fact, they fasted 2 times a week, okay? And Jesus himself, encouraged that his disciples fast. When you go into the early church, the church after Jesus had gone back to heaven, they made a practice of fasting on a regular basis. In fact, they would not choose leaders until they fasted. Fasting was a part and parcel of the process of choosing leaders, because the Bible says that the apostles gathered together and they fasted and then they lay hands. So a commissioning service is a fasting service. So the early church fasted, and even the early church fathers, after the New Testament and the canon of the Bible had been closed, the New Testament fathers also fasted. So that is enough to tell us that we should fast, and there is no evidence that says that fasting has stopped or we should stop it. But again, because I do not want to assume, let's take a little bit of time to look at what is fasting. What exactly is fasting? So I will define biblical fasting, and I underline the word biblical. Biblical fasting as a voluntary act of abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. Biblical fasting is a voluntary act of abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. And I'm choosing my words here. Number 1 is voluntary act. So this is not a case of I don't have food in the house, and then I turn it to fasting. No, it is a deliberate act to say, I'm going to abstain from food. It's not a case of you were incarcerated or you found yourself stranded somewhere, you do not have food. Those are compulsive. They are situations, okay? And it will not qualify to be called fasting. Fasting is a voluntary act of abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. The second point there is for spiritual purposes. For spiritual purposes. So the fact that you don't have food and you find yourself at 2 p.m. not having eaten, you can't convert it to fast. You can't say that is a fast because you did not set out to do any spiritual purpose. In fact, I have an equation that I say that abstinence from food minus prayer is equals to hunger strike. So if you are not eating and you are not praying, you are not necessarily fasting. So the mere fact that you do away with food is not enough to say you are fasting. You must do away from food, and you must do it for a spiritual purpose, to seek the face of God, and that includes prayer, that includes study of the word, that includes being quiet, listening to God, listening to message, just seeking God. So it's important that we must separate fasting and hunger strike. Fasting and starvation are not necessarily the same. Fasting is not dieting. Fasting is not dieting. It's not a case of I am overweight and I want to skip 1, 2, or 3 meals so that I can lose weight. No, it's got to be accompanied by a spiritual searching and looking for God, chasing after God to be able to qualify for fasting. Okay, now I've given the equation of abstinence from food minus prayer equals hunger strike. At the same time, if you do it well, fasting plus prayer, it's very, very powerful. I want to say fasting plus prayer is equals to atomic power. Derek Prince, the wonderful teacher, calls fasting actually the intercontinental ballistic missile of the Christian faith. Countries of the world have weapons of war, and once in a while they display it for their enemies to see so that they can stay away from them. This, in the same way, fasting and prayer is the spiritual weapon of mass destruction that we believers have. If we use it well, it has absolute power to change the course of life, to change things itself. You see, the truth is that Jesus fasted, and he also encouraged us to also fast. Okay, now let's talk about the definition of fasting that I said. I said abstinence from food in a voluntary manner to be able to seek God. You notice that I did not talk about water. And let me say this, one of the things I want to do in this series is to be able to debunk myths around fasting. There is a lot of traditional thinking that are not biblical based, and I want to be able to change that in the course of this teaching. Fasting has nothing to do with water. That is, when you fast, you should drink water. That may be surprising to you if you have a traditional and religious mindset, but hopefully we can put that aside and look at what the scripture says. Let's do it in a few minutes more that I have. The Bible talks about Jesus fasting in Matthew chapter 4, and it tells us that after he was done, he was hungry. The Bible talks about the temptation that he had. At the end of the period, he was hungry. There was no mention of the fact that he was thirsty. That tells us that Jesus was drinking water in the course of the 40 days prayer and fasting. Okay, it says he was hungry. As a matter of fact, what he was saying there is that when you are fasting in a very protracted manner, at the beginning you may feel hungry. After a while, your body gets used to it, and the hunger pang goes away because the body is used to habit. Okay, now when you finish, the hunger pang returns as a natural consequence of you finishing the fast. That's what he was saying. But he never said he was thirsty. You see, when you are thirsty, what you need is water. When you are hungry, what you need is food. So Jesus was not thirsty. Why? Because obviously he was drinking water from time to time. And medical science also tells us that water is more important to the body than food. So your body can do longer without food than it can without water. This issue of water is so important and our health that I'm going to dedicate 1 or 2 episodes to talk about fasting and your health. I'm going to look up to experts because I am not a medical person, but for this particular episode, it is sufficient to note that fasting does not stop you from drinking water. You see, in Mark chapter 8, where the Bible records of Jesus feeding the people, there was no mention of water. Again, we could liken them to fasting because they've been with him for like 3 days, seeking the face of God, and that meets our definition of fasting and prayer because they were abstaining from food, but there was no mention of water. Obviously, they were having access to water and they were drinking water. The Apostle Paul also talked about, he said, in testing and fasting often. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 27. He said, in hunger and thirst, in fasting often. If fasting and thirst were the same, the Apostle Paul would not have separated it. He will not have put a comma. So when you are fasting, you are not allowed to be thirsty. You are allowed to be hungry because fasting is abstinence from solid food. And food is actually solid nourishment. But water you cannot do without. Last but not the least point, someone may say to me, what about Moses? He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And actually in Exodus 34, the Bible says, when he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, he did neither eat bread nor drink water. This is perhaps the only incidents where the Bible talks about somebody staying that long without food and without water. And shall I tell you what? This is a unique situation because it says Moses was in the presence of the Lord. He was right in the presence of God. And my summary of it is that, my theory of it is that he was actually in the presence of the Lord, so much so that his physiology was actually suspended. His humanity was suspended. God took over. He was so much in the presence of God and the realm of the spirit, he didn't need food, he didn't need water. Nobody can do that without food, without water, without the supernatural assistance of God. So this is a unique situation and we cannot make a rule out of it. We need to be very, very careful. You see, fasting needs to be properly understood for us to take the best benefit and advantage of it. So in conclusion, I have told you that ancient history told us of different people who fasted, the Chinese, the Indians, and recent history has shown us in Bible times, Old Testament, New Testament, post Jesus going back to heaven, early church fathers fasting. I hope that that and the little touch on some of the benefits of fasting, which is spiritual and health wise, has convinced somebody that fasting is for you. I hope you are convinced of the power of fasting and that fasting is for you. In the next episode to come, I'll be looking in details as to the benefits of fasting and how should we do it. I will be debunking a lot of myths. I just want you to stay with me as I build this layer upon layer. And once again, thank you. If this has blessed you, help us by sharing it on the various social media platforms. Visit our website, www.tenets.tv, and help us to spread the news by liking us, by rating, by sharing, and by reposting. Once again, thank you for creating the time and see you next episode.